Whenever you build a website, sometimes you find yourself using quite a good array of technologies. And some of these are necessary, some of these have alternatives, but there are two of these that you cannot escape from, and these are HTML and CSS. To an extent, JavaScript, but I'm sure you can build a simple static web page with just HTML and CSS. So in this video, I'll focus on the principal differences between HTML and CSS. So what is HTML? HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and HTML defines the content and structure of a web page. So for example, when you visit a website and you see a button, or you see a text input, or you see a drop-down menu, all these are HTML components which define the content of the page. CSS, on the other hand, brings in some styling and display aspects and applies them onto these components, these HTML elements that you have on the page. And that's what brings about the cool look and feel of your web application. For example, the color, the position of things, and all the design aspects that you can imagine for a website. I think the best way to understand this is by looking at some code. So I'll go ahead and bring up my editor here. This is the code from the previous example where we talked about the basic structure of an HTML page. So you can see I have a black and white page here, and so there's no styling. Basically, when you use HTML on a page, it's just black and white, and you use CSS to give it some styling, maybe color, and we'll see that now. So you can see first, an HTML page is interpreted from top to bottom, which is why, so the elements on the page, so I put a heading here and a paragraph second, and when you look at the browser, you can see exactly that order, the heading and the paragraph, and there is no style, no color, nothing. So to add style to my page, CSS, there are several ways you can add styling to the page, which could be inline, or you could use the header. I'm not going to talk about inline styles, but I'm going to do a quick demo with the styles in the header. And I'll just say, for anything that is an H1 tag, I want to give it a color of red. And I'll save that. And now, when I refresh my page, you see that my heading now has red color. The text is now red. However, I like to separate my CSS from my HTML. That way I can reuse it in multiple files, which is what you should always do. So I will take away this CSS style from here, and instead I will create a separate CSS file, and I'll call it styles.css. And if I go ahead and say H1, and I say color is red, and then, well, if I refresh this page, you will see that it goes back to the black and white because I have not told it, this HTML file, where to get the styles from. And to do that, I simply use a link tag in the header of my HTML document. I define the relationship between this page and the page I want to include in this one. So I say it's a style sheet, and I give it an href, so I tell it where to get the page from, and it's going to get my styles from this, and I close that. And now if I refresh the page again, we should see my header. Now for demonstration purposes, I'm going to take this out. I'm going to use divisions instead, and I'm going to call this first. I'm going to copy, I'm going to paste like 3 times, and I'll say second, third, and fourth. If I go ahead and, okay, I'll take off this star, I don't need this anymore. And if I go ahead and refresh this page, now you see my divisions lined up there. So you see the first one is displayed, second, third, and fourth. So HTML an HTML document is interpreted from the top to the bottom, and you would always see the components coming in the same order with which you put them in the file. But CSS is there to change all of that. Well, let's just take a few examples here to see how CSS works. So first thing you want to know when you're working with CSS, you're dealing with selectors. So you want to pick out specific items, specific elements on the page, and you give them different styles depending on what your needs are. So I'm going to start by just designing these. So I'll start here. First of all, I'll put an H1 again, and I'll say my simple web page. And if I refresh this, the H1 tag is there. It has the default styling. There's nothing that has been added to it. Now I'll go in here and I'll say div, and I'll say border 1 pixel solid gray, and I'll say width. I'll give it a width, and I'll say 200 or 200 pixels, and I'll give it a height as well, and I'll say 200 pixels. Now if I refresh this, you would see that everything that is a div has a border, but my H1 tag, which is a heading, does not have a border. I could go ahead and give it a border as well. So I'll say H1. If I refresh that, now you see it also has the same styling as the divisions. I'll take that out. I just wanted to show you that distinction. Now, this is good, but there is a problem, right? So maybe I want this division to have a different styling. So maybe I want this one to be red, I want this one to be green, I want this one to be blue, and I want this one to be something else. But because I have applied the styles on the base tag, which is a div, anything that is found on that page, which is a division, would have those styles applied to it. So what I could do is I could come here, I could give this an ID. So I'll say ID. No, instead of using the ID first, I'll go with a class attribute. So maybe I want these first three elements to have a gray border, and I want this one to have a blue border. So I'll go ahead and I'll say content, and I copy these, and I'll just paste the same thing in the next two divisions. And for the last one, instead of giving it a class of content, I'll give a class of menu, right? And well, if I refresh my page now, everything is still the same because I have not changed my CSS. So instead of applying my styles directly on the div, I would say any div that has a class of content. And how does that know it's a class? Because I'm using a dot, a period here. When you use a dot, it means you're saying a div with the class named content. And if I save these and I open up the page again, you will see now only the first three divisions have that styling applied to it. I could go ahead and say, I'll copy this and I'll copy this and I'll say menu, and I'll give it a border of orange or orange red. And if I refresh that, now you see that the third division has a different border. But well, I'm repeating a lot of stuff here, so maybe I just want all my divisions to be the same style. So I'll apply some styles to the base div tag instead. I cut this out from here, and then these as well. So now what happens is that all my divisions what happens is that all my divisions have the same width and height, but now I style those that are content, those have content differently and the menu differently. And if I refresh this, you see the same thing. So I could go ahead and add some border styling here, some margin. Let me say margin of 10 pixels. And if I refresh, okay. And I could go ahead and change the way the components are laid out on the page. So I could say float to the right. And now you see I am changing the positioning of my things by using CSS and so on. And that's what CSS does for you. Another very important selector that you would find yourself using with CSS is the ID. And I could go ahead and call this second because it is my second, but well, you want to look for better names. And if I go ahead and I say any div that has an ID of second, so you can see the difference. When I was referring to the div class, I used a dot, and now I use the hash symbol when referring to the ID. And I could say give it a background of yellow or red, yellow. Now you see. Well, so far I've been using the standard colors here, but you want to use hexadecimal colors so you have a wide range and you can play with various shades as you want. But as we have been able to see, HTML is there to lay the different components on the page, and CSS is there to give it some styling and some positioning. So I'll leave it at that for now. I hope to see you in the next lecture.